Thus, by 1960, it became evident to Carlos Sr. that the deteriorating situation was now a permanent reality, and he joined the mass exodus of people fleeing the island. Carlos Sr. first went to live in the state of Connecticut, where he worked with his brother-in-law at the renowned Raymond Cifuentes of the Partigras brand, growing tobacco. He worked in Connecticut for a brief time until he traveled to the Dominican Republic, where he began exploring the possibilities of growing tobacco in a new land.
When I think back to 1959, when I think back to the time, where our family lost all of their land, lost all of their growing operations, we together with the other factories and the other brand owners that lost everything. I mean, I always think, those men at those ages, they were 40, 50, some of them 60 years old. They had a right, or at least they had an excuse. They could have said, look, we helped build this industry, now we're going to go do something else. Or we're going to cry, or we're going to have a pity party, whatever it is. But these men were so passionate about the leaf, so passionate about the business, that instead what they did was, they fled to different countries, like the Dominican, like Honduras, like Nicaragua, and recreated the industry.
The truth has been that the Torano name is synonymous with tobacco. And it's synonymous because in every country in South America and Central America that has grown tobacco for cigars, there has always been a Torano involved in that business in each of those countries. From Cuba to Nicaragua, Honduras, Brazil, Ecuador, Mexico, and most especially the Dominican Republic. My father chose the Dominican Republic as a land to begin to recreate the tobacco industry that had been lost in Cuba. My father brought Cuban seeds to the Dominican Republic and started teaching the Dominican growers how to cultivate this new type of tobacco. This seed, known throughout the cigar world as Piloto Cubano, is today recognized as one of the best tobaccos in the world. He helped to create a new tobacco industry and became one of the most respected tobacco men throughout the country, both for his love of the Dominican Republic and the Dominican tobacco. My father truly felt that the soil in the Dominican Republic could grow as good or even better tobacco as the Cuban soil.
To this day, Carlos Sr. is heralded as a pioneer in the Dominican Republic. After his death in 1970, every major newspaper in the Dominican Republic published an article reflecting on his many contributions to their country. They spoke of a foreigner of great distinction who had come to their country to give rather than to take. He labored with the government and with the people to teach them everything he knew from his native land about growing tobacco. With him, he not only brought his knowledge, but his passion for tobacco.
To this day, 50 years later, when I go to the Dominican Republic, a lot of growers stop me to let me know that they are in the business of growing tobacco due to the helps that my father gave them and to the excitement that my father had about the possibility of growing tobacco in the Dominican Republic.
One of my biggest regrets is that my grandfather passed away when I was so young. I was about 3 years old, so I've always heard stories that he got to know me as a little boy, but I didn't get to know him. And so one of the great joys of being in this cigar business, of which there are many, to me one of the greatest joys has been to almost getting to know my grandfather a little bit by being in the industry that he was such an important part of, and walking the streets of Santiago in the Dominican Republic, having people stop me and say, oh, you're Carlos Torano's grandson. I learned a lot from your grandfather. Your grandfather was a great guy, he was a great man. And so a neat thing is, I have to say, as I was growing up, I didn't have much of a connection with him because of how early he died in my life. But then it was later on in my life when I joined my father in this business that I've really got to know him, I've got to respect him, and I've really come to feel closer to him by being in this business, by walking the fields that he walked, by having some of the same challenges. And ultimately, we named our cigar after when we say Carlos Torano, we named it after my grandfather. And so now, both I, my father, and hopefully one day my son and some others will continue in his tradition.
After the death of his father, Carlos Jr. received a phone call from his cousin, who had been working in the tobacco industry in Nicaragua. He proposed that they join forces and continue the business that their fathers before them had cultivated with such sacrifice and dedication. Thus, Carlos Torano Jr. decides to follow in his father's and grandfather's footsteps by becoming involved in tobacco growing.
Such a difficult job, such a difficult work, because you really have to have a passion for it, like my father had and my uncles had. And of course, when you come over here in this country, you go and you went to the University of Miami, you have a degree in finance and economics or whatever it is, and you think that the world is going to be yours, and you begin to realize that there's nothing greater than to continue in the tradition of the family. Especially that there was a passion in my family for tobacco that, even though I didn't realize it, I had it. Although my father had growing operations in the Dominican Republic, these operations were closed after he passed away. Thus, when I first began my journey in the tobacco growing business, I joined my cousin Jimmy Torano in Nicaragua. We grew filtered tobacco in Nicaragua and eventually expanded our growing operations in other countries, including Honduras, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Mexico.
As they toiled in the many countries growing tobacco, it became clear that consumption of handmade cigars was declining in the 1970s and 1980s. As the demand for handmade cigars declined, so did the orders for tobacco leaf from the cigar factories. However, remaining true to his vision for tobacco and tapping into the entrepreneurial spirit, Carlos Torano Jr. decided that if the demand was not there for the leaf, he would have to create it.
So the family created a company called Central America Tobacco. The purpose of this company was to help join both distributors and manufacturers together to create private label brands. If we could help the factories finding distributors and generate more business for them, they would make more cigars and those needed more tobacco.
Through the company of Central America Tobacco, the Torano family made its first direct involvement in the cigar side of the tobacco business. Since 1916, the family had only been involved in growing tobacco and commercializing the tobacco leaf. However, as the cigar side of our business grew, a decision was made to focus exclusively on cigars and to no longer sell our tobacco leaf to other cigar factories. And so by the early 1990s, we were no longer involved in the tobacco growing business and had officially transitioned all of our efforts to making cigars.
The Toranos' decision to focus their energies on the cigar business in the early 1990s was a prophetic one. By 1993, the handmade cigar business was experiencing a renaissance that led to a massive explosion in sales and demand. During this growth period, the cigar company flourished as the Toranos worked with a veritable who's who in the tobacco business, making private labels. Although the company was growing, the Toranos understood that in order to control their destiny in the cigar business, they had to control their own manufacturing and launch their own brand of cigars. Thus, the Toranos transitioned from the role of middlemen to becoming one of the leading cigar manufacturers by opening their own cigar factories in Honduras and Nicaragua, and by launching their cigar brand under the family name, Carlos Torano.
There's a special pride and responsibility when you put your family name in a cigar brand. From the start, we knew that our brand had to be about quality and value. We were going to use all of our expertise and knowledge of tobacco growing in each of our blends, and we were also going to make our cigars affordable to the vast array of cigar smokers. We were going to choose each tobacco leaf, create every blend, teach every roller, and supervise all quality control in a manner that would best represent the Torano tradition.
Eventually, the Toranos employed over 1,200 people who were actively working in their cigar factories. One of the many keys to their success is the loyalty and longevity of their supervisors, rollers, and bunchers. The handmade cigar business is all about people.
And still to this day, I love that part of it. There are still a lot of people, especially the elders, who say thank you for being there. Thank you for working with us. I always used to say that everyone in the factory was part owner, from myself to the guy who cleans the floor. Everyone was always considered an important factor to this enterprise. We always respected the people who worked for us, conscious of not only the wages and the laws, but the well-being of the workers. We established clinics, giving medicine and taking care of their families. We were always careful to share in our success. It was important to keep everyone who was good with us, because there was a lot of competition at that time.
Today, the truth is that the Torano name remains synonymous with tobacco. From the time Santiago traveled to Cuba and fell in love with the tobacco leaf, to the present, the passion for tobacco growing and cigar making continues to run through the veins of each generation of the Torano family.